was already raging in Europe, America was still neutral. A British naval blockade in the Atlantic kept scores of German ships trapped in New York Harbor.
German ships tried to run the British blockade, some made it through, some did not. So a lot of the captains kept their ships out of harm's way in ports such as New York.
Even if a German ship wanted to leave New York Harbor, U.S. authorities wouldn't allow it. At the same time, tons of U.S. ammunition and war supplies were being shipped out of the city to France and Great Britain, and those explosives were bound for the war against Germany.
There was this stewing animosity for the United States and the hypocritical stance that the Germans felt they were taking. And so their best solution to all this was to blow up as many munitions depots as possible, because that's what ended up harming them the most when they got back to the front.
There was only one way the Germans could stop the flow of ammunition to the Allies: sabotage. A promising candidate emerged. A German naval intelligence officer arrived in New York City under a false passport. His real name was Franz von Rintelen. His job? Running a spy ring.
Franz von Rintelen decided he was going to infiltrate as many munitions depots as he could. And the comment he had before he left Germany that he gave to his superiors was, "I'm going to buy up what I can, and I'm going to blow up what I can't."
While much of the German spy network operated out of embassies in New York and Washington, von Rintelen worked locally, and with the help of a German scientist in Brooklyn, he perfected a deadly little firebomb the size of a cigar.
It was a lead pipe the size of a cigar, hence the name cigar bomb, that they would put a piece of copper in the middle. And on either side of the copper, they would put two fluorescents. When they would eat through the copper, they would ignite and start a fire.
And so what the Germans did was they planted these little cigar bombs on ships, and they were designed to explode when they were at sea. The thickness of the copper is what determined how long before the ship was out at sea and actually caught fire. There was nothing anyone could do about it.
The cigar bombs were being made right under the nose of U.S. intelligence. There were secret bomb factories on board German ships at the city's docks. But Franz von Rintelen wanted a bigger prize: the huge munitions depot in the middle of New York Harbor. Black Tom Island jutted out into the water just off the New Jersey mainland. Trainloads of war material arrived from as far west as Ohio.
There were tons and tons, hundreds of tons of munitions being transferred. So they would come in on the train, be unloaded. Within the next tide, be loaded onto waiting barges and then to waiting ships to be taken overseas. It was a target that would have been the prize of any espionage ring, even in today's standards.
Franz von Rintelen started casing out specifically Black Tom, and he walked the docks and sort of made a map of what it looked like and decided this was going to be his big target. But what happened was the U.S. authorities were already on to him.
Von Rintelen fled New York for London, but federal agents had followed him. He was arrested when he arrived and spent the rest of World War I in an English prison. But von Rintelen had left a team of saboteurs back in New York City, and on the night of July 30th, 1916, the operation went forward without him.
They waited till the darkest part of the night when security was at its lowest, and they picked the perfect day. There was a barge sitting there with tons of TNT, which had not gone out the last of the tide for the evening, so it stayed there, which was against policy. There were also freight cars that were loaded with TNT, and nitroglycerin, and dynamite, and ammunition.
There were two men who had rowboats, German spies, who were in rowboats on the New York side of the harbor, and they were equipped with these cigar bombs. On the other side, right across from Black Tom Island, which was full of train yards and factories, was another man, and the idea was, let's get him working there, so he's familiar to the security staff at Black Tom Island. And when he came on the night of the explosion, the security guards who recognized him didn't think twice when they saw him walking around.
The German agent who stood by security guards entered the weapons depot to my left and planted what were probably cigar bombs into the boxcars that were loaded with explosives. Then he escaped back through the rail yard. At the same time, two entered the depot from the harbor side and planted more bombs on floating barges and train cars. They rode back out across the harbor. I'm standing on a secret of New York that's now a part of Liberty State Park in New Jersey. In 1916, it was a small island filled with enough explosives to blow up a town. 20 minutes after the German agents left, just after 2 a.m., this entire place was on fire.
Unfortunately, before they can get any of these fires under control, it was too late. The explosion was loud enough to be heard, according to reports, as far away as Baltimore and Connecticut.
What the saboteurs blew up was the largest munitions depot in the country. So that included everything from bullets, detonators, it was sticks of dynamite. It was basically a year's worth of ammunition that was being sent to the British and the French was blowing up in a span of 2 hours. It was an explosion that was so vast, it was a 6-point and higher on the Richter scale. The Brooklyn Bridge was just swaying back and forth.
You can still see the remains of the train tracks at Black Tom's rail yard at Liberty State Park. Most of the depot had been devastated by the blast. The Statue of Liberty had a big piece of shrapnel in her arm. Pieces of metal and glass covered lower Manhattan. But because the explosion took place between 2 and 4 in the morning, the death toll was surprisingly low, which is exactly what the Germans had in mind.
The attack was designed to minimize the number of casualties. The level of shock after it happened was actually not as high as you would think, because there was still an idea that this was an accident at a private railroad. And when the New York Times reported about the explosion, there were no reports of it being a blatant attack by the German government.
The Germans always planned to keep their activity a secret for as long as they possibly could. The idea was keep the Americans friendly or at least neutral towards the Germans. They could not afford to have them enter the war.
Less than a year after the attack, the U.S. did enter World War I, but no one listed Black Tom as one of the causes. The men who planted the bombs were never caught, and it took decades for the Germans to finally admit what they had done. As terrible as that explosion was, it wasn't the worst violence in the city's history. Half a century before Black Tom Island, in 1863, New York City was in turmoil.